Welcome to Creating a Family. Talk about adoption, foster care, and kinship care. Today, we're exploring a topic that may be new to many of our listeners. It's called Pathological Demand Avoidance, often also called PDA. It's a behavior profile that can be especially confusing and challenging for parents and caregivers raising those children who have experienced trauma, loss, or prenatal exposure. Hello, my name is Tracy Whitney, and I am your host for today's conversation. I am also the content director for creatingafamily.org, and I'm thrilled to be able to introduce you today to Dr. Cynthia Martin, who is here to help us understand pathological demand avoidance, where it comes from, and how to support our children who face this diagnosis. Dr. Martin is a clinical psychologist trained in pediatric neuropsychology. She is an expert in autism and neurodevelopmental disorders. She currently runs a private practice in New York City, and prior to opening that practice, she was a clinical professor at Cornell and Harvard Medical Schools and the senior director of the Autism Center at the Child Mind Institute. She has published in peer-reviewed journals, presented nationally and internationally, and co-authored book chapters. Her work and expertise have been featured in popular media outlets like Time Magazine, CBS Mornings, ABC Now, and Fox 5. She's also an adoptive mother of two. Welcome, Dr. Martin.
Hi, good morning, Tracy. Thank you so much for having me and for the warm welcome.
We're so glad that you came and spent some time with us this morning to talk about this. We actually received a letter from one of our listeners, and they were asking us, what is pathological demand avoidance? Where do I learn more about it? And how does it impact our family? And how do we help our child with these behaviors? So that led me to do a little bit of a deep dive and start looking into what it was. I had never heard of it, and how to support families who are raising children with this diagnosis. So let's talk a little bit about what it is and how it's different from just maybe typical defiance or resistance that children just show developmentally across the stages.
Wonderful. So pathological demand avoidance, or what people commonly refer to as PDA, it's a behavioral profile. So it's a cluster of patterns of behavior that we observe in a broad array of individuals, many of whom have underlying neurodevelopmental conditions. And what we see is that individuals have really high reactivity and resistance to everyday demands. So something that for a lot of people feels kind of neutral, or maybe even feels a little bit boring or mundane or not the most fun thing, to a person who has a profile of PDA, that demand might feel incredibly overwhelming or very threatening. It can often trigger or elicit a strong anxiety response that can lead to a lot of avoidance or shutting down. And on the outside, it can look like willful defiance or disobedience, but it's really due to having an extreme need for autonomy or control over one's environment, and really not feeling comfortable doing that thing that the person is asking them to do.
So can you help us understand where that might come from, where that resistance or that overwhelming anxious response might come from?
Yeah. So one of the things is when we're thinking about PDA is it's not a clinical diagnosis. So it is more of a cluster of traits or patterns of behavior that we observe in an individual. So where the demand avoidance might actually be coming from is likely going to be a transdiagnostic combination of one or multiple neurodevelopmental conditions like autism and ADHD, along with co-occurring anxiety or mood dysregulation disorder.
Okay, so kind of a mixed bag of origin that has these, you keep saying cluster of behaviors. So is there like a profile of behaviors that fit this cluster combination?
Yeah. So when I say behavior, I mean what we observe. So a behavior is something that is observable. We see it on the outside. Mm-hmm. So it's something that we can measure, we can time, we can count. Like my behavior right now is I'm here speaking with you, answering questions. I'm moving my hands around as I talk. Those are all things that are observable to the person on the on the outside.
Okay.
That's just kind of a way to think about when we say behavior, that's what we mean, things that we can observe on the outside. Behavior, though, is often just the tip of the iceberg in something. So what we might observe and we might see may or may not actually be reflective of what's actually going on under the surface of that and what's really driving that behavior. So when I talk about those surface level clusters of behavior, generally what we see is a child who, when you want them to do things that are just part of ordinary daily life. So let's get up and get dressed. Come eat breakfast now. Oh, the bus is here. We need to get out the door. Put your shoes on. When they're in class, the teacher says, okay, everybody eyes up here. Take out your morning work. Let's start our independent work. It's time to pack up now and go to gym. These just kinds of everyday, daily types of expectations and requests of people. To a child who is described as having this more PDA profile, they may have a really hard time going along with those expectations and those demands. So that could range from starting in the morning, when the parent is saying, okay, come on, get up, we got to go. It's almost time. It's almost time to go to school. Let's go get breakfast. That child might say no. They might just not respond and just keep doing what it is that they want to do or what they're more interested or their attention is more focused on at that time. Or you might get a really extreme outburst. The child might cry, scream, yell, say a lot of unkind words. So you could have a whole range of those things.
Okay.
And that could happen really at any time. It could be things that happen at home when the parent is giving these everyday types of instructions and demands and expectations, or and it could happen equally at home and at school, or you might see it more in one environment than in another. So depending on the relationship that the child has with the individual who's making the demands or giving the directives, and also kind of their level of being able to cope with those demands in that particular environment might mitigate how flexible or cooperative or tolerant they are of those demands and expectations. So you might see, that's just all to say, you might see more tantrums or meltdowns because of the expectations in certain environments and in certain interactions. You might see more of those in some of those situations than in others.
Okay. And how does it relate? You mentioned neurological conditions like autism and ADHD. How does it relate to those types of neurological differences?
Yeah. So when I have parents calling in saying, I think my child has a PDA profile. I've been reading about pathological demand avoidance. I think this really applies to my child. When I get those calls and then I go through a pretty comprehensive evaluation for the child, I often find that the child does meet clinical criteria for a neurodevelopmental disorder, oftentimes autism. And typically the type of autism that I see in individuals whose parents are calling in describing these PDA profiles is typically a form of autism where the child has very strong and high language skills, and they often typically have really high cognitive or IQ skills. So they have some things that just come so easy for them. Mm-hmm. And these could be things that for the majority of people actually don't come very easy for them. And so for these children, it comes super easy. But then the things that are the routine daily expectations, the social expectations, the executive functioning expectations, those things do not come as easy for them. So I often see that there's that asynchronous development and that real unevenness or mismatch in terms of what their strengths are and how those strengths fit in with their weaknesses. And that comes from a neurodevelopmental place because it's just how their brain is wired. They are processing information in their day-to-day life differently from the majority of kids around them. And that is what I see is it's often coming from autism, but it might also be autism and ADHD together because Kids who have autism have much higher rates of also having ADHD. And ADHD can really affect how you can navigate your day to day, how you can focus your attention and be able to delay gratification, and also be able to inhibit and manage any impulses that come in. So I see that kids who have that combination of autism and ADHD, along with having pretty high IQ, they often have some co-occurring anxiety that when we put all those things together are often what's under that surface of parents saying like, my child, this PDA just makes a lot of sense for my child.
Right. That's a lot for a kid to manage.
Yeah.
All that internal state stuff. Hey, listeners, sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to let you know that we want to hear from you. How did you find this podcast? Where did you listen to it? What brings you back if you are a repeat listener? We want to know, what has your adoption, foster, or kinship story been like so far? We love learning about you and what makes you tick, so please use the link in your podcast player or the link in the YouTube show notes to share something about yourself with us today. Let's go back to our interview with Dr. Martin. So for our listeners who are parenting children who've experienced early trauma or prenatal substance exposure or other challenges at the beginning of life, how do those layers impact or mimic PDA or create the conditions for PDA?
Yeah, that's a really good connection there. So especially when we think about early trauma, so early trauma is going to impact brain development. Mm-hmm. And it's going to impact how a child, the associations that a child makes with various factors in their environment. If a child has been in a situation where they have felt very unsafe and they need to really shift into survival mode, their brains are going to remember that. So even when they are out of that situation and now they're actually in a stable, safe environment, their brain is still wired to be really anxious and sensitive to any possible trauma cues or signals. And so when there are certain trauma cues or trauma signals, their little brains are just going to shift into an anxious, protective state. And one of the primary hallmarks of anxiety is avoidance. So when something triggers anxiety in a child, especially if that anxiety is coming from a place of trauma, you're going to see a lot of avoidance. And sometimes that avoidance can also have some behavioral signs where, maybe there's some of the obvious ones where they're withdrawing and they don't want to go near that thing that's making them feel anxious. But you can also see pretty extreme dysregulation and really heightened behavioral responses like yelling, screaming, kicking, crying, pulling their own hair, pulling somebody else's hair, doing things that could be destructive towards themselves or to other people because they have become so dysregulated in face of that trigger for anxiety that's related to that trauma history. So that can involve a lot of avoidance. That can look a lot like what we see in children whose parents are describing these PDA profiles.
So you described avoidance. That's fairly common. And you described reactions that maybe seem out of proportion to the ask or to the scenario that's going on. What are some other behaviors that might be kind of little clues that we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, so some other clues can be when a child has the ability to do something, but when it is imposed on them, they have a really hard time doing it. So to give kind of a simple day-to-day answer, we need to put our shoes on to leave the house, right? Putting your shoes on is a skill. You've got to be able to know where your shoes are. You have to go and get them. You need to put them on the right feet. You need to close them in some way. So there's a whole series of steps of skills to be able to complete the task of putting your shoes on. So a child might be very capable of doing those things independently, but might really struggle to actually do it independently. And if you notice, well, wow, they struggle the most when I say, hey, come on, it's time to put your shoes on. And by making that statement to the child and telling them, hey, come on, it's time to put your shoes on, you get a really big reaction that just seems really disproportionate with the ask. And it might even be the child's going, they need to put their shoes on to go outside and go somewhere that they actually really want to go. But
Right.
by the person placing that demand, hey, go put your shoes on right now, you might get that really big reaction to something that they're actually capable of doing.
So, how can you tell the difference then between a child who is having just a stress response to
Mhm.
maybe the rush or the hurry of getting their shoes on, and someone who is having this big reaction and they truly, in that moment of dysregulation, can't?
Right. Great question. Great question. So, a lot of it comes down to really observing patterns across time. So, seeing, okay, is this a one-off? Like, is this just happening, in the mornings when, oh, I mean, as parents, we know like the mornings are so hard. Says the parent who put her kid on the bus yesterday with the kid's backpack on my back, which is not helpful. So, yep, did that yesterday morning. So mornings are can be really tough and hectic.
Yeah.
So if you look at the situation and you notice, like, you know what, on the weekends when me as the parent, I'm calm, I'm relaxed, there's a ton of time. My
Yeah.
child has no problem doing this when I say, oh, this is what we have to do now. And it's really just concentrated on these like rushed, harried moments when there's lots of things going on. And I'm, as the parent, maybe putting a lot of extra pressure on the situation. Well, that's going to be pretty typical and appropriate. And also, given the age and the developmental level of the child, you want to also think about that. Like a really young child, a toddler, my goodness, those toddlers, they really want autonomy. So, God forbid that you ask them to do something. It really needs to be their idea because
Right.
they're learning, and it's developmentally appropriate that they're learning. Like, hey, I have agency. I can say what I want to do and when I want to do it. So
Yeah.
if you notice, like, all right, this is really just happening in these key moments, or this is part of a pretty typical developmental stage of what we would expect for
Right.
where this child is developmentally, then it's really not going to be something that's part of a bigger clinical profile. But if you start noticing, like, wow, this is happening in a lot of different things. And it's happening pretty regularly, and I'm seeing it happening in different types of situations. It's happening at home, it's happening at school, it's happening across multiple parents or caregivers, it's also happening with teachers. And then the question you always have to ask yourself is it a problem? And if it is a problem, because, and you want to really think about that, is it a problem? And it is going to be a problem if it's getting in your child's way of something. If you're noticing, like, wow, they're really upset a lot of the time, or
Right.
they're missing things because of this, or they're missing out on
Okay.
opportunities. Well, so now that you're seeing a pattern over time, it's happening in multiple situations, it's present more days than it's not, and it is actually creating a problem for them in some way. Well, then that is more indicative of there's probably something clinical going on that's going to need a little bit more specialized investigation and some more help and support to get that child in a more comfortable place to be able to manage the demands of everyday life.
And you mentioned that sometimes if it's just a developmentally appropriate need for independence, one of the things that's tricky in our community of adopted, foster, and kinship kids is that
Mhm.
because of their early life trauma or other challenges that they experienced before joining our family, they are often developing unevenly. And
Absolutely.
so I think your point about observing is really well taken. I think we, as the parents, need to, just as a friend of mine said a long time ago, become students of our children.
Mhm.
And it just takes that long-term observation, the just kind of looking and watching. And I think also that we shouldn't be ignoring what our gut says. So
Mhm.
this is really impacting our child's quality of life. And based on experience with other children or what you know about typical child development, if you know that these clusters of behaviors are negatively impacting their quality of life
Mhm.
or your family's quality of life, because the whole family can be impacted by these things, then it's time to go ahead and start thinking about, what's going on clinically.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think within that, another thing that as parents that we have to be really mindful of, especially when we're parenting children who have complex histories that may have had adoption histories, disruption in care, trauma, foster, we really need to look very much into our own patterns of behavior and our own beliefs about what children should be doing. We have to almost take on an unhumanly degree of introspection into ourselves, how we were parented, when our child engages in certain kinds of behaviors or actions, how that impacts us. And we have to really be aware of those things because we have to be so present for our child in a way where we are aware of what some of our natural knee-jerk instincts are going to be and be
Right.
able to think to ourselves, is this the best thing to do in this moment? Or do I need to pause that for myself a little bit?
Yeah. Yeah, that brings up also the additional point of self care. So, along the way, you need to know yourself, you need to know your triggers, you need to know your history, but you also need to come to the table fueled and ready to handle what's going on. Because when you're trying to help a child manage these challenging behaviors that probably feel very uncomfortable and scary and confusing for our kids, we can't do that if we're bone dry in our
Right.
well, you know? And
Absolutely.
so knowing yourself, and I love your point about knowing your triggers, knowing your family history, knowing how you were parented. We have great resources at Creating a Family to help parents and caregivers dig into that if they're interested, but then also coming to the table fueled and refreshed and ready to handle what today has for you and your child.
100%. And being patient with ourselves in that, because,
Yeah.
most of us, I think we now are, there are cohorts of parents now who are not from the 1900s, like most of us. But a lot of us we were parented differently. There was a different understanding of children and neurodevelopment and mental health when many of us were being raised. And so we do want to think about what we know now and how we can navigate parenting a little bit differently than how it was
Yeah.
navigated for us. And I mentioned that as being an important factor because for a child who struggles with meeting demands and expectations of everyday life and experiences a lot of dysregulation due to those demands, we are not going to be able to help them by meeting inflexibility and rigidity with inflexibility and rigidity. So,
Right.
two
Right.
inflexibles doesn't make a flexible.
Right.
So, as the parent and as the adults, we're the ones who are going to have to take on an immense amount of patience and flexibility and understanding of our child in order to really be able to help them. And that takes a lot of making sure our needs are met with self care, like you were describing.
Our founding director, Dawn Davenport, used to tell me when I was learning about adoptive parenting, set your expectations low and then be willing to lower them again.
Hmm.
And holding those expectations loosely is such a key to navigating the steps ahead when you're looking at something like PDA or any other impact that our kids have to face when they're learning how to navigate the world after adoption or foster care. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, because PDA is not a formal diagnosis, it can be really hard for parents to know where to start and who to contact and what to do. How do you think parents could kind of start the process of having their child evaluated and working with a professional who understands this?
Right. Yeah. So I would recommend connecting with a professional who has a background and expertise in neurodevelopmental disorders and internalizing and externalizing conditions that commonly co-occur with neurodevelopmental disorders. So not somebody who kind of only knows autism and ADHD, but they understand autism and ADHD, and they also understand anxiety, depression, behavior disorders,
Okay.
mood dysregulation, because it's really when a lot of those conditions come together. And so that could be a psychologist, a child psychologist who specializes in pediatric psychology or neurodevelopment. It could also be a developmental pediatrician or a child psychologist. There are some child neurologists who've done additional training specifically in neurodevelopmental disorders. It could also be starting with more frontline community-based providers, like it could be mental health professionals at your child's school, or it could be a local counseling agency. And so reaching out and saying, hey, these are some things I'm seeing with my child. I noticed that completing everyday activities that they're actually really capable of is very, very challenging for them. And I've read a lot about PDA, and I think they might have some PDA profile present. I would like to get some more evaluation for their neurodevelopment to see if there's any identifiable clinical diagnosis that might be driving some of this behavior.
Okay. So when a parent or caregiver walks into that first evaluation meeting, what should they share with the evaluator to help them understand kind of the full picture of what a parent might be or a caregiver might be feeling very concerned about?
Yeah, well, so I think they want to share what they observe. So, as somebody I do many evaluations with children from all over the world, actually. And so I always start with listening. I want to do a lot of listening, a lot of asking open-ended questions and really hearing about what do they see in their child day to day? Where are the pain points or the trigger points? Where are the hard moments? And I want to hear a lot about that and give the parent a lot of time to really think about it, talk about it, and describe it.
So you're not necessarily running down a checklist with a parent or a caregiver. You're starting a conversation and kind of letting them unfold what they see and experience in everyday life.
Absolutely. And then I'm asking questions within that because as
Okay.
parents are describing that, then I start picking up on, all right,
Okay.
I'm
Okay.
hearing some things in the realm of neurodevelopmental differences. Oop, I'm hearing it sounds like this child probably has super high IQ. Oh, I'm hearing some features of anxiety now. Ooh, I'm hearing some patterns of behavior that seem like now they've been reinforced within this family system or within this school system. Ooh, I'm hearing some lack of attunement between some of what this child's temperament and needs might be and how the environment is kind of geared towards approaching them. And so I want to hear all those pieces. Then there's also going to be some checklists involved. And so that's going to be a little bit more through, we have a lot of norm-based broadband scales, narrowband scales. Broadband scales are going to look broadly at any common child neurodevelopmental or mental health condition. Narrowband scales look more specifically at specific disorders. And so I'm going to also administer some of those because that gives me some norm reference data to look at the presence or absence of certain types of symptom profiles for this child as compared to children who are of a similar age and similar gender, biological sex at birth, norm referenced samples. And so I'm going to do some of that. I'm also then going to be doing some direct testing as well as observation with the child because that'll help me to understand, okay, are there some identifiable neurodevelopmental disorders present? I'm also going to want to know about the child's cognitive skills. So, how are they thinking and processing? What are their reasoning skills like? What's their processing speed like? That helps me understand their cognitive functioning and how they are using their brain to just navigate day-to-day situations, whether at home or at school. And what we often see in a lot of kids is there can be a lot of unevenness where they may have some things that come really naturally, other things that can be a bit more effortful for them. Some things might be below age level. And if there are some of those, we want to capture and understand where those are. And so I'm going to be administering a lot of testing with the child and having the parents complete measures as well. And then I'm going to want some information about the child in other environments. So that's going to often come from teachers, or if the child has been working with a therapist or a group of outpatient treatment providers, I'm going to want to also get some information from them, either from them also completing some norm reference scales or providing some reports. I'll usually do collateral calls to talk with families, or sorry, talk with providers, other providers or teachers over the phone to again hear what are they seeing? Where are the tough parts for this child, and also where are the child's strengths? What are the types of scenarios or situations where this child is really functioning at an optimal level, and where are the areas where they are more dysregulated and really not functioning well for themselves?
Wow, super thorough. And it sounds to me that you're saying as soon as the kids are able to report their own behaviors or their own feelings and thoughts, you include them in the process as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's great.
Absolutely. Because their perspective, they are, kids are wonderfully the experts of themselves. And so I always tell when I meet with a child, I tell them, oh, I'm a little bit like a teacher, I'm a little bit of like a teacher mixed with a scientist. I want to learn about them, and they are the expert of themselves. And I'm going to be asking some questions and doing some activities so I could try to figure out them. But I need their help in order for me to figure that out, because what they like and how they feel about things might be really different from what another kid their age likes and feels about things.
Or even different than what their parents and caregivers might be reporting.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So is there kind of an age range that is most common for families that are landing in your office?
Typically, when kids are landing in my office, when I'm getting calls from parents saying, I read about PDA, I think my child might show a lot of demand avoidance, I would like to get them evaluated. Typically, they are as young as kindergarten, first grade, and then up into the early to mid teenage years. So It tends to be around big transition points where they often, what I hear from parents is they kind of always knew their child was a little bit different than the majority. They needed things in a little bit more of a different way than the majority of kids, but it was manageable. They were able to accommodate. They were able to have teachers who really could kind of individualize and understand what that child needed. But then they got into an environment where that accommodation and understanding was now no longer happening. And maybe that wasn't happening because now all of a sudden there's a big jump up in what's expected of kids of that age. So there might be a big jump in developmental expectations. It might also be a period of time where now the academic coursework has increased in complexity a lot. So a child who kind of knew their ABCs from the time they were 2, they flew through preschool and kindergarten really easily, but then they got to first grade, and now there's a lot more work and a lot less play. And you're starting to now see like, oh, wow, they are really not on board with doing these things. It's creating a lot of stress for them. And so it's usually at those or school age and transitional points where there's been a big jump in expectations, whether they be for executive functioning or social functioning or independence in their day-to-day life.
Well, that's a great segue into the part of the conversation that every parent who's been listening thus far wants to know. What will help our kids and help us help our kids? So let's talk a little bit about some of the strategies that you find to be most effective for parenting a child who has these pathological demand avoidance traits.
Great. So this part, I'll talk about it kind of generally,
Okay.
but I want to give a caveat to that to keep in mind that there's really never going to be a one size fits all for any child, and kids who have demand avoidance, you do have to get a bit to the root of why is that demand avoidance occurring, and then what are some of the situational factors that are exacerbating. So you do need to really understand it at an in-depth level for your individual child. But I'll talk broadly about some areas, some trends that I typically see as being helpful.
Okay.
So, an analogy that I like to use to start with is to think about your child as a flower. Okay. And so when you think about flowers, let's say you're growing dandelions and you're growing orchids. Now, if you take one environment and you try to grow both your dandelion and your orchid in the same environment, one is going to thrive and one is going to not thrive. And it's going to be the orchid that can't handle that environment. Now, in that scenario, you don't look at the orchid and say, "You defiant thing, you're not doing what you're supposed to do. This is so wrong." You're not going to get upset with that flower for not doing the same thing as the dandelion. You're going to immediately recognize, like, oh, this is not the right environment for this flower. These are both flowers, and these flowers have different needs. So now kids are, of course, much more dynamic and much more complex than flowers. So I know that as humans, we are not quite as simple. We're not going to be as happy with just like having our environment set up and being watered from time to time, but so much more dynamic. However, I think it's a nice framework and baseline to think about to start. So, because the first thing when we're seeing like, ooh, we are really going head to head with our child in something, and we're trying to get them to do something, whether it be brush their teeth or clean up their room or do their homework. And we are getting huge meltdowns when we ask that. And we think what we're asking is very reasonable. So when you find yourself in that situation, the first thing you want to do is take a step back, look at the environment. You want to think about, are there certain things that are exacerbating my child's lack of apparent motivation or meltdown response to these expectations? And so you want to first take a look at those things. You want to also take a look at yourself and how you are approaching that. So are you giving your child any type of warning that this expectation is coming up? So are you trying to go from they've been on screens and maybe on something that's quite addictive for a young child's brain, like YouTube? Are you trying to go immediately from YouTube with no warning to you need to brush your teeth and go to bed? So that is recipe to not go well for a lot of kids. And kids who have that PDA profile, you are very unlikely to be successful in that situation. So you want to look at all those factors. In general, we want to try to give children a high degree of control over their own decisions and the course of actions that need to take place. Now, when I say a high degree of control, though, I don't mean completely loosen up. It doesn't mean it's a free for all and whatever the child wants to do is what they get to do when they want to do it. That's not healthy either. But we need to give them a high degree of perceived control. And so some of the ways that you can do that is you can shift your language around from having more of a directive form of language to using more declarative statements. You can also give your child a cue that something they don't love to do is going to be coming up soon. So going back to that example, child is there in its downtime, they're enjoying some screen time. You want to kind of set up the screen time already in advance so that they know that at some point it is going to end. So maybe your regular routine is in the evenings, we regularly after dinner and before bed for this 30 or 60-minute period of time, we have screen time. Like as a family, that's what we do. So when that's coming up, you want to let your child know, oh, I see that you're watching insert whatever it is. You're watching a YouTuber who's describing Minecraft, all those influencers who walk through the
Right.
Minecraft things. Maybe you say like, "Oh, I see. Oh, you're really interested in that Minecraft. You're watching the Minecraft person right now." I notice that screen time is going to be over in about 5 minutes, and then just pause. Right?
Okay.
So you're just bringing it into your child's attention that like, ooh, they're interested in something. You notice they're interested in that. And you're also noticing that the time is starting to get short and it's going to be time to wrap that up soon. So that helps bring the upcoming transition into the child's conscious attention
Okay.
without you directly saying, in 5 minutes, that's over, because that you might just get a reaction. When you use more of a declarative statement, it gives your child the chance to say, oh, they're right. Okay, this is happening. I've got to do this thing next. So it gives them the chance and opportunity to be the ones who rise to that and say, oh, well, yeah, I don't want to go brush my teeth. I want to finish doing this. And that's likely, I mean, I think very few children are going to be like, oh, wonderful. Yeah. You know what? Let me just turn this off 3 minutes early and go brush my teeth. But it gives them the opportunity to say something like, oh no, I need to watch more of this. I'm not done with this. And then that, as the parent, gives you the opportunity to help them with the flexibility and some negotiation and compromise, where you can say something like, you can validate, oh, I know this is so important to you. I know you love that. You love this YouTuber. This is so interesting. I wonder how much time is left on that video. And you can always say, I wonder, like you're wondering yourself. You're not saying to them like, well, how much time is left? I wonder how much time is left on that video. And then that gives them the opportunity to maybe look and say like, oh, actually, there's only 3 minutes left. And so great. Now they've paid attention to that. Oh, there's only 3 minutes left. Oh, well, nice. Well, there's only 3 minutes left and you have 5 minutes left. Or if they say, oh, well, there's 7 minutes left. And then maybe you say, oh, okay, well, you have 5 minutes left, but this video is there's only 7. So do you think, would it make sense to finish this, like get to the 7 minutes? I can be flexible and do 2 more minutes of screen time before we go on to brushing our teeth. It helps have this dialogue where then your child could say like, oh yeah. And then they're also feeling comfortable and safe and understood that what their priorities are. You're not trying to abruptly get them to finish what they want to do, to go and do something that nobody particularly likes to do. And so that helps them make those connections around being able to down regulate from one thing and transition into the next thing. Now, at the same time, if your child says, oh, there's 3 hours left of this. Well, now that might be something where we're not going to be able to wrap that up in, something reasonable within 5 minutes. So then it gives you an opportunity to offer something else there. So, oh, wow, okay, there's 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever it is. Oh, that's a lot of time. So there's a lot of time left on this video you want to watch. And we have 5 minutes until we're going to have to start thinking about going on to the next thing. And then you just kind of pause. So you want to make some of these statements and then pause, because that gives the child an opportunity to think about a solution.
Okay.
And then within that, if they are coming up with something great, but most kids aren't gonna come up with something that you're likely going to be immediately in agreement with. So, but they might come up with something, or then you can suggest something like, oh, I wonder, so this is really important to you. I wonder what would happen if we find a part where it could be paused. Is there a point where it could be paused? And then kind of wait and ask. And so so this is why for the parent, you have to really have your self-care really well stocked, because this takes a lot of patience to be able to ask these questions and pause and negotiate with the child. Then once you start getting the point where it needs to be wrapped up, you can say, again, giving them control over things, do you want to pause it or should I pause it? Should we take it with us into the bathroom or should we leave it here? So you're giving these options two choices at a time to kind of guide and give the child perceived control around that transition.
And we always remind parents, make sure the 2 or 3 choices that you're offering are choices you can live with. Because if
Absolutely.
you offer
Yes.
choices that are unreasonable or untenable for you, and that's the choice your child chooses, you're stuck with it. You offered
You're
that
totally
to them,
stuck.
and you want to be a person of integrity that sticks to their word because you're modeling this for your child. So don't suggest way out crazy things that cannot be implemented. Because I can guarantee you that's going to be the one that your child chooses.
100%. And then another thing within that is you want to make sure that you don't phrase something in the form of a question where if the child says no, you don't actually, you're not actually going to honor the no. So something
Right.
like, do you want to brush your teeth right now? If you ask that question and they say no,
right. Where do you go from here?
Exactly. So if no is not an acceptable response, don't frame it as a question.
Right. Right. Do you want to brush your teeth right now or in 5 minutes?
Excellent. Yes.
Or with the grape flavored toothpaste or the bubblegum flavored toothpaste?
Excellent. Yes, exactly.
Oh, so it sounds a lot like you're advising parents to reframe their approach and come in gentle and soft. That's not going to trigger any of that self-protection that would rise up. We talk a lot in trauma circles about giving voice and choice. And it sounds to me like this is just kind of an extended version of that with a lot more parental patience and flexibility built in for that individual child.
Absolutely. And with that, what you're then teaching the child over time is you're teaching the child that the people around them understand what is important to them. They see that and they want to help them to be able to have time to do the things that are important to them. And they simultaneously know that there's some things in life that we just have to do. And we know those things are hard for them. And we're going to help them to be able to do that. And we're going to do that in a way that doesn't overly trigger and overwhelm them from the perspective of the anxiety. And we know that for a lot of these kids, the idea of cognitive flexibility, so of like coming up with of what could be a reasonable compromise or how could they through this,
Right.
it doesn't come as naturally. So that's where providing that declarative language and sometimes even really formally teaching them in a clinical setting how being flexible actually gives them more power and what being flexible means and in concrete ways how to learn how to be flexible. That can be really powerful for a child, as well as giving them some psychoeducation around what actually happens in the brain when they experience anxiety and helping them understand what some of their anxiety triggers are.
So that brings us to the conversation about the therapies and interventions that we parents and caregivers can be seeking out for our children, in addition to the strategies and frameworks that we're working on at home. So what therapies do you see to be most successful when a child is in a clinical setting getting help for this?
Yeah. So I think, so some of that, I'll talk kind of generally, because again, I think it's really, it ends up being, it has to be for any type of clinical work to be effective, it has to be so individualized to that child. And so we have made a lot of advancements in the field where we have a lot of better tools and we have a lot of good evidence-based therapies, but how those specifically apply to the individual child is not going to be cookie cutter. So you do want to make sure that you're working with a provider that has a really solid background in evidence-based intervention, as well as a really just good understanding of therapeutic processes and temperament, child development, dynamics in relationships. You really need to have all of that in order to really effectively individualize and tailor an intervention approach to a specific child and family. So, but within all of that, some general things that I find to be helpful is I really like the unstuck and on target credit program that was developed by a group at Children's National. It's so wonderful. It teaches kids really broken down skills around how to be flexible and why being flexible is valuable. And to be able to think about flexibility as a tool and a resource that they can use in their day-to-day life. Because some kids are just not going to be as naturally flexible, and that's okay. We're not trying to change who people are, but we're trying to have them understand what their own natural tendencies are and how they can navigate the world in the most effective way for themselves. And so giving kids these tools where they learn what it means to be flexible and how to be flexible can be really valuable. And that also there's a parent coaching component where you can also give parents tools and strategies around how to help their child be more flexible. So I like that one a lot. Another one is from Ross Green. He has the collaborative problem solving. I love that. I mean, just being able to help a child understand, we have to have shared control over many situations in life. And there's going to be some things that are important to them, other things that are important to other people. And we have to find some mutuality around how to navigate that together. It often can't be all one way or all another. I find those approaches really helpful. And then a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy for understanding of anxiety and the cycle of anxiety and how we can have a lot of automatic negative thoughts that even if we might have some evidence to say, well, maybe some of them are true, they might not be very helpful to us in that moment. So understanding how to help our thoughts and purposefully use thoughts that can be a little bit more helpful in that situation, I think has a lot of value. And then within cognitive behavioral therapy, when we're thinking about cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety, you can learn more about, from the physiological perspective, what's happening in your brain and in your body when you feel and experience anxiety, and how can you help counteract some of that by using some mindfulness or deep breathing types of strategies to reverse some of that anxiety response. And now I know every single kid says deep breathing doesn't work, blah, blah, blah. That is always where kids start. But it is true that if you do truly learn how to use some of these strategies in an effective way, it is absolutely not going to make you go from experiencing anxiety to having no anxiety in those situations, but it's going to help to not make the anxiety worse in those situations. And so that's often when we're using these strategies, is what we're trying to do in those moments, is help a child recognize what's happening in their body, do something when it's starting to bubble up at a low level to stop it from getting to a higher level. And so I find that the combination of those different types of interventions and modalities are often helpful for a lot of kids who have a lot of this demand avoidance. And as I say, that one other caveat is also looking at where any skill deficits are that they have, because there might actually be some things that they really can't do independently. And we need to scaffold and teach those skills in a way where they can be more successful.
And all of what you just said just reminded me of a strategy for parents to try at home that would be narrating our own experiences. Mm-hmm. Ooh, I'm feeling really anxious right now. I just got home and I have 4 things to do that are all pressing on me and feel really big and all need to be tackled. I need to think about how I can just do one at a time.
Absolutely.
And kind of narrating, because that's going to mimic what they're hearing in their therapeutic interventions, noticing what's going on inside of ourselves, narrating it out loud for our kids, and then going about modeling how to implement all of that. I find, when our kids are developing language, depending on how young they've joined our family, when they're first developing their language, it's a very natural response for moms and dads to talk to babies and talk to toddlers in ways that are kind of above that baby's or toddler's understanding. And it's the same concept here. If we're working with a kid that just can't because of all of what's going on in their internal state, modeling that language, narrating with them, gives them the language. And I find in, my parenting experiences and in the families that I get to work with, I find that when we are giving language to children where language wasn't there before, whether it's emotional language, learning how to identify their feelings or understanding what's going on inside of them. It's so empowering and equipping for the kids that they start to want more of it because they like how it feels when they know that they can say, this is what's going on inside of me, Mom. How can you help me with it?
Absolutely. And that is one of, I think, another reason why it's so valuable for parents to say and narrate some of that out loud is because otherwise the child doesn't know. They're observing behavior, and especially if a child comes from has a complex history, they are likely going to be viewing what they see in a way that might not be truly reflective of what is actually going on for that parent or in that situation. And they're often going to be looking at situations in a way and interpreting them in a way that might be geared towards making sure they remain safe. And there aren't things that are going to hurt them or trigger them. And so when the parent is just saying things out loud, like, oh, I have 4 things on my mind. Well, now that helps the child understand, oh, when I saw Mom's face like that, or I saw that body language, I thought I did something wrong and they were upset with me. Right. So it takes out of that, and it normalizes so much and helps teach so much to that child who's really paying attention and is hypervigilant to their environment.
Yeah. Listeners, I have one more interruption, and I'd like to tell you about the Jockey Being Family Library of 15 free online courses, and they're available with a certificate of completion if you need it. Thanks to the Jockey Being Family Foundation, we can offer these 15 courses. You can take 1, 2, or all 15. It's up to you. And you can find them at bit.ly/JBF support. That's bit.ly/JBF support. Let's go back to our interview with Dr. Martin. So, talking a little bit about the caregivers and the parents, this again is a long, patience required kind of process. What's something that you can offer to parents and caregivers to help them feel like they can wrap their hands around something and get effective at maybe just one thing?
Yeah, well, I would think if I had to pick just one, if you are noticing that your child has a strong pattern of behaviors that seems to be suggestive of a PDA profile, I think one of the best things you could do is take a look at what are all these demands being placed on them during the day. And what are the ones that are really like the must-dos? I mean, they're really crucial and need to be done because they are something that is very important and critical for that child's life functioning. And then what are all the things that actually really don't matter? And really ask yourself that. And then focus your efforts on the things that really are important and just drop out some of the things that are a little bit less important. And then within that, prioritize your relationship with your child and helping them not have repeated experiences of really high, insurmountable degrees of anxiety.
So observing what's going on in your home and what's going on with that child, and then streamlining where you can so that you're majoring on the majors, not majoring on the minors. How can we set ourselves up for success in this process while still maintaining some level of order in our homes?
Yeah. Well, I think you want to keep in mind that for at least like most of the kids who I see, when parents are describing PDA profiles, most often the kids do have neurodevelopmental disorders. So many times autism, sometimes autism and ADHD, and those are lifelong conditions for most kids. Now so what that means is they are going to be navigating life in a way that is different from the majority of people around them. So you want to be thinking about this as a marathon, not a sprint. Don't expect to have change overnight. really be thinking about how can you set up rhythms and patterns in your family, in your child's day-to-day life that is going to help them over time be able to navigate the stressors of life in a way that is most optimal for them.
So, for parents who are just beginning to suspect that this conversation about pathological demand avoidance might apply to them and their child, what words of hope or encouragement would you offer them as they kind of get started on all of these observations and self-care and things like that?
Yeah, well, I would say that because a lot of what we see in kids whose parents are describing a PDA profile, because there are identifiable conditions associated with most of those profiles, whether it be autism, ADHD, anxiety, mood dysregulation, we know a lot about those clinical conditions now. And we know a lot about the heterogeneity and the variability and the complexity in the transdiagnostic presentation. And we are so much better able as a field right now to be able to help kids with those profiles. So I would say the hope for parents is get connected with a professional who can do a deep dive in the evaluation, because we know a lot more now about those identifiable neurodevelopmental conditions than we did even 10 years ago. And there are many more tools that schools and providers can use to help kids be able to navigate life and be able to learn skills and strategies that don't come to them as naturally.
And I think one of the themes that I've heard throughout this entire conversation that I would offer as hope and encouragement to parents is that when you are educating yourself and educating your child, you are creating the opportunity for this child to be a great self-advocate and very self-aware so that they can go on to find what makes them thrive and what makes them shine. And to me, that's what pretty much every parent wants, is how can I help my child thrive?
Absolutely.
Well, Dr. Martin, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your experiences and your expertise. Thank you for helping us understand how ADHD and autism and trauma and all of those things can play into and go into the whole complex cluster of behaviors. I think this conversation is going to be very helpful for many of the families in our community who listen and are trying to navigate challenging paths ahead of them with their kids. Listeners, we're going to put some links in the show notes to help you out if you think this might apply to your family, so you can start to do your own deep dive and look through those resources. So thanks so much, everybody, for listening, and thank you again, Dr. Martin.
Thank you so much for having me.